right, everyone here is early.
Excited for this one.
Grant even slicks back the hair.
Oh yeah. Got to keep the eyes clear for this, you know? Who knows what'll happen?
Could get intense. All right, well, thank you everybody for joining. I'm gonna play a little background music while we wait.
Some waiting room music.
Yeah, our Make Better little theme song. Oh, that's fun. You guys can hear it.
The intent was there though. So.
Oh, I'll get this to, don't you worry. So we have 161 people that have registered. So we're gonna need to give people a couple minutes to join. You hear now, Grant?
Negative.
No?
Uh-uh.
Wow. That means that Zoom is really good at background noise. Nothing?
Nothing.
I can hear it. I was jamming. All right, we've got a good group so far. See, Pete, how many people are on right now? Can you see?
I think about 30.
Okay.
So maybe give it 2-3 minutes.
Cool.
I think you'll record it, right, Amelia, and then we can send it out to everybody after too.
Yep, just about to say that. I'm going to.
I make it a party. You bring the party. Yeah.
There we go. Sorry, Camden. Yes, this will be recorded and put on YouTube. So, everybody knows Podcast Movement is happening next week. So we might need a couple days to get this live, but it will be there, and everybody who couldn't make it will be able to see it and rewatch it again and again. Hello, everybody that has come in. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to get started in just a couple minutes. And if you have joined, we just ask you to mute yourself. There will be time at the end for questions. You can either drop those in the chat, or I think at the end, if you raise your hand, we'd be happy to unmute you and let you go through that question, but just so that we can keep the audio clear.
And I think too, what I'll do now later in this call, we'll go through sample results. So I'll actually just post them here. So everybody should be able to go into them now. You don't need to, see them now or anything, but there's the link for later too.
Yeah, dive in, get your questions ready. Make sure you ask Grant and Pete about p-values.
And I think we're only giving away what, $2 million, Pete, for the best score on the pop quiz at the end of this, right? 2 million, you decided?
Yeah,
2 million questions or $2 million? Oh,
$2 million, yeah. $2 million. So.
Provided by RSU. Yeah.
Something like that. Something like that. I thought Amelia was gonna actually front it, but
yeah. I think that's what we agreed on. Actually, it was Oliver who will be doing it, but yes.
So, all right, maybe we give it about 30 more seconds and then
30. All right. Sounds good. Once again, everybody, this will be recorded. So for people that do trickle in, that is no problem. And if you have to jump at any point, we'll make sure everybody has the link and the slides and the results. But for anybody just joined, Pete dropped the results that we'll be going through in this webinar in the chat. So if you want to take a look at those, prep some of your questions, go through anything that's confusing ahead of time, we'll be ready to dive into that.
Very lightly doctored results.
Yes, anonymized, of course.
And then, so during it too, Amelia, people should post questions in the chat too, and you'll field those towards the end. Is that how we want to do it?
Exactly. Yeah. If you have any questions as they come up, again, please mute yourself, but drop those questions in the chat. There might be some time throughout the webinar if there's anything like super topical that we can jump to those. But there's definitely going to be a big section at the end. We'll offer up for some Q&A, and Grant and Pete will be able to ask all the technical questions.
All right.
Awesome. All right. Should we get started, everybody? Let's do it. All right. Well, thank you all for joining. This was definitely not what we anticipated. I think the original sort of goal we had set was around 50 people. We soon got up to 100, and we actually had to expand or open up the registration so that we could accept more. So very, very exciting, obviously a hot topic. But really today we're going to be talking about incrementality and specifically measuring conversion lift in podcast advertising for both direct response brands, small brands, large brands, all of that great stuff. This is going to be one of many pixel-based incrementality modern measurement webinars. So we've got some stuff at the end if you do want to stay in the loop around upcoming webinars that Podscribe will be putting on. All right, so let's first introduce our incredible guest speakers. Everybody here probably knows Pete. I'm sure most people know Grant as well, but Pete, the CEO of Podscribe, really leading the charge in pixel-based attribution, modern measurement solutions, verification, all of that. Pete comes from, I think it's probably almost 8+ years of specifically ad tech experience. So before the podcast space was really in the world of how can you use different technologies to provide specific marketing and measurement solutions. And then we have the amazing Grant, who joins us specifically representing the buyer and the advertiser side. He's the director of offline practice from Right Side Up. He has, I think, around 10+ years of experience in the industry, really, leading the charge and buying specifically for some of the largest spenders in the podcast space, whether that's Calm or DoorDash, ZipRecruiter, Blue Apron. So again, Pete on the ad tech side, and then Grant, who also happens to be a Podscribe, humble Podscribe advisor. Those two in particular really worked together with Grant, again, sort of helping break down, how Podscribe is approaching our incrementality, what the methodology is, how can we make improvements and continue to refine it, and how can we increase not only, again, measurement, but what the incrementality space has been before. Anything else you guys wanted to add?
I think you nailed it, and yeah, I think the only other thing is to thank you for coming, everybody. In the rough format is we go through slides for roughly the first third of it, where me and Grant just sort of talk through them with questions from Amelia, and then to make it not just an abstract thing, we want to go through some lightly modified results from actual clients, so you can see what they look like, see kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and you can kind of get a real feel for it. And then the last third or so, hopefully we can turn it over just to questions if there are any.
Awesome. All right, well then without further ado, let's dive in. So hopefully everybody on this call has a high level understanding of what incrementality is. If you don't, we will be diving into that. But before we kick that off, there's a lot of myths and misconceptions around what incrementality is, specifically in the podcast ad space. So Grant, from the buyer space and from the buyer side and things that you have seen, what are some of the most common misconceptions around incrementality and what it can provide?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, overall, one of the biggest myths is that it just can't work for podcasts, right? And the reasons for that myth are, given as, statistical significance, right? There's not enough activity going on to actually measure properly. Or the ad tech behind podcast advertising just simply doesn't exist in order to create a solid control groups. Moreover, and we'll talk about this more, control groups aren't stable enough or accurate enough to actually create a true control exposed. I think all of those are big reasons that folks in podcast advertising don't necessarily, think about this as their first method of attribution. I think also, and we know here, people think it's expensive. People think that they have to onboard like a completely new ad tech platform, right, on top of a, Podscribe or other pixel attribution solution in order to get like a true lift study. And I think what we'll show today is that that's not the case anymore, which is extremely exciting for me and for the brands that I work with.
Amazing. Pete, anything else you'd add?
I think that what Grant says is pretty spot on. I'd say, a lot of these myths people think to some degree or another, because there is a little bit of truth to each of them. But I think what hopefully we can show here is that while some of them, may have, may not be like entirely false, I think they're largely, it's largely time to re-examine them.
Awesome. So let's go into that. Let's demystify really what incrementality is, what conversion lift is, all of that great stuff. So Pete, would you walk us through and actually define not only what incrementality and specifically incrementality testing are, but what measuring conversion lift is?
Right. So there's probably somebody on the call who might be able to kind of correct my definition and provide a better one. But incrementality is, at a high level, it's comparing your expected results of the performance of your campaign from the exposed group to another group that is similar in all ways, except that they were not exposed to the campaign. So there are different types of incrementality. I think the two most common types in podcasting, one is brand lift. So this is not really the focus on this call, but that brand lift is more when you provide a survey to people who were exposed to the podcast campaign and those who were not. And the questions are like, have you heard of McDonald's? What is your opinion of McDonald's? And then you see if the results improve for the people who were exposed compared to those who weren't. So that's more of like the brand lift, which is certainly useful in itself. And one other kind of lift, which is more of the topic on this call, is specifically conversion lift. So both are subsets of, I think both fall under the incrementality umbrella, which is sort of confusing, but conversion lift will be, instead of measuring the difference in survey results, it'll be measuring how many more conversions the control or the test group will have than the control group. So specifically, measuring visits via purchases, signups, installs for a group that was exposed to the ad compared to some control group. And we can get into the numerous ways to create a control group, but that's specifically the conversion lift subset of incrementality here.
Great. And so the goal is really to understand what Grant usually says net conversions or net audiences or net visitors are driven from specific marketing campaigns, channels, and in our for our sake, really in podcast advertising.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I think that's true. And honestly, if you want to go back a slide for a moment, just another piece of context to add around, what Pete's so rightly saying and can put more eloquently than me. I do think that this is really important for podcast advertising specifically, because we are a very unique media industry that is really focused on either proving to direct response performance-based advertisers that dollars are working for them. Obviously, I come from, a very DR focused area in the industry. But I think also as we try to expand towards $2, $3, $5 billion as a marketplace, being podcasts, we need to prove to some of those bigger brand advertisers that the dollars are actually pushing extra weight and not just collecting some of the credit from our channels. And so even though conversion lift, I think, is very specific to down funnel, like deep performance metrics, I think it is relevant for both of the aims of what we're trying to do as an industry, which is grow the performance marketing side of it, and also prove to brand advertisers that, like, hey, this is here and it actually does work. There are incremental audience here because of cord cutting or interest groups or whatever. They are here and they are, pulling their own weight. So conversion lift is a really nice way to really look at it and really prove it.
Awesome. So beautifully said. So perfect segue to our next slide, which is, Grant, again, from the buyer, from the advertiser's perspective, why should you test conversion lift? Why should you test incrementality? What is the importance behind that? And what does it help you answer?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one key reason for me is if you think about the marketplace divided into kind of, smaller, potentially more niche or targeted audiences, and then the bigger, more broad reach audiences, the Rogans, the Color Daddies of the world, you as a performance advertiser want to know, is it worth doing, the really targeted stuff on smaller shows? Even though I'm seeing performance on these giant shows, is that just collecting response from my TV campaign or my programmatic display buy or what have you, just by virtue of the fact that it's super sizable? So I think the biggest reason for me, at least, is understanding the relationship between scale of podcasts and ultimately like reach of the show, and ultimate conversion activity, net conversion activity, not just gross conversion activity. That is all of the conversions that are coming in for a particular campaign. And as you kind of like move forward through that idea and thought process, you think about, okay, well, if I find that, out of my 10 shows that I'm running, 8 of them are extremely incremental and 2 of them are looking really good from just a CPA perspective, but the incrementality scores are just awful, maybe that's an optimization lever that you can pull. That it won't necessarily make your overall portfolio CPA better, but what it will do is it'll create true value for your brand, because you're actually bringing in incremental results. So like it's kind of funny, right? Like in performance marketing, we think about like a channel silo and then the portfolio between the 10 shows, and we're trying to lower the CPA all the time. But sometimes you can actually keep the CPA the same and drive more value for your brand, just by doing some of these like really deeper, almost like 4D optimizations. And I think incrementality can really assist with that. And then lastly, I would say like a big question that comes up for us is when we're running really successful campaigns, right? Or sometimes they even look too good. C-suite, maybe, folks slightly above the general marketing manager folks that we're working with, they might see this and say, wow, who knew podcast advertising could work so great job? But for real though, really? And that's where we, could really benefit from an incrementality study by saying like, yes, look, like this is reporting that we got from Podscribe or whomever that says, hey, out of 100% of conversions, 80% of them are truly incremental that you wouldn't have gotten anyway. And also, are you getting that kind of reporting from your other major channels that you're spending on? TV, paid social, search. And we could spend another hour talking about the incrementality of search, right? Lots of money, how much incremental? I don't know. So I think communicating that up to decision makers who manage multi-channel portfolios, this is a really key component to understanding like where those next dollars are going to go.
That's great. And then, again, one of the misconceptions was, oh, I'm not big enough, or I'm not spending enough money, to be able to even run incrementality tests. And I think with Podscribe's tool, we're breaking that notion down. But can you help us understand, can smaller brands, run incrementality tests, and why would a smaller brand that isn't a McDonald's or a Starbucks, want to run incrementality tests?
I think they could. I think there's still necessarily a guarantee they're big enough or spending enough where it will be useful for them. But I think in terms of like, what might be a dollar amount where they might where they might see like I might have to mute somebody, where you might see an impact, it kind of, I would say, maybe a couple $100,000, but realistically it's sort of a relative to their overall budget in other channels and how many people are visiting their site. So like, like a McDonald's, they might need to spend a bit more to see any kind of incrementality, but so it really depends. So I would say for many smaller brands, it is a very viable thing. But to really summarize why I test for incrementality, I think oftentimes see the attribution results agree with incrementality or be quite close to it, especially for brands that are not super well known. They often can be quite in line, but I think it can be useful to get a second check from another angle on your attribution results to see, are they in line with what my promos and stories are saying, what the pixel based attribution is saying, just to get to triangulate it to see if anything is seeming out of whack, because sometimes I think it can be. So I guess that's a segue to
perfect segue. So again, Pete, Grant, how do I know as a brand advertiser that I do need incrementality? I think you guys touched on some of these, but what would you say the most common things are?
Right. Well, I guess just to finish that thought, so I wouldn't say incrementality, I wouldn't say it's necessarily something that entirely invalidates all attribution. I think all attribution is often quite useful, and I think it gives roughly the same results for many brands. And I think in the next slide we'll go into like a little bit more specific the exact difference between the two, because that will probably help clarify some things. But probably for most people on this call, if they've run attribution, there's probably been times when you thought pixel-based attribution is looking a little high. And that is often, it's sort of a simple way, but that can often be a bit of a telltale sign. If it's like a 30x multiplier on the promo, maybe the discount was very poor on the promo, or maybe there was some better discount on the site, or the host mumbled it or something. But if it's like kind of consistently looking high, and if you suspect, if you're a brand that a lot of people likely have already heard of and are purchasing on the audience, you're gonna have some baseline of that audience already buying it regardless. So for smaller brands that people haven't heard of as much, that number is very low, so it doesn't make that big of a difference. So yeah, I think those two results are looking a little high, and if you suspect, a lot of people already know of your brand, you've got a lot of users, customers already, and yeah, if you've got a lot of spend going on other channels, but I'd say the first two maybe are pretty important.
Grant, and anything else?
Yeah, I would actually say, for me, in my experience, interestingly, it's really the third one that drives folks most to incrementality. Not to say that the first two aren't major contributors as well, but marketing, and specifically performance marketing, is so momentum driven. And once you have a brand that starts working, man, you just start spreading on every channel, spending as much as you can in an optimized fashion to drive scale at efficient, cost pers, whatever those might be. And so for my brands, that are really begging and on the bleeding edge of this incrementality for podcast attribution, are the ones that are spending massively, not only on Meta and Google, so paid social search, but also on CTV and linear and OTT and VOD, and some of those higher reach channels that you can pick up a lot of awareness, which goes kind of to number two, and might actually be driving a lot of the conversion activity. The one thing, we didn't put on the slide that I'd also add is, while Pete's comment about, statistical significance and, spend thresholds is true, I don't think if you're a smaller brand, you should necessarily not think about this, because in my experience, some of the bootstrap companies that we work with that, they're only spending 25 or 50 grand a month in the space. They need every single dollar to be incremental in terms of their response. And so I see this as such a great tool that, either now or future iterations, can help those smaller brands really get traction, and not just, like I said, on a spreadsheet of here's your cost pers. Do you feel it yet? A true wow, podcast advertising is building my business with my money. And I think that's really powerful for founders of small to mid-sized companies.
Could not agree more. I think beautifully put. So going back to sort of what Pete was saying, there is a difference between incrementality and attribution. And obviously attribution or incrementality is a form of attribution, and they all fall under the umbrella of really measurement. But again, they both answer two different questions. So Pete, can you help us understand really what attribution answers, and then why it's different from incrementality, sort of going back to all the reasons why we want to test it out?
So yeah, this slide here is, I think, something that maybe we as an attribution company could probably explain better but so attribution, standard pixel-based attribution that we popularize, and most other similar companies popularize, and that is common with Facebook and elsewhere on the web. It is the attribution on the left, and what it shows really is, of the listeners, really households who were exposed to the ad, how many of them then who were exposed proceed to visit or purchase the website within the conversion window, within 30 days or whatever the window is set at. So oftentimes, if somebody is exposed to an ad, especially if it's a brand they likely haven't heard of, what are the odds then, within a week or two or something after the ad, they go to the website and purchase. In a lot of cases, that's a fine assumption to make, that they purchased probably because of the ad. And there are things too, we'll let you do it on the site, where you can sort of whittle down possibly some conversions where they may have come from another channel. We can say you can exclude conversions that have a refer URL of Facebook. So somebody, say, who saw a Facebook ad, clicked it to go to the site, then purchased, even though they may have heard a podcast ad earlier. There are things you can do to sort of whittle down some of the conversions that maybe, podcasting arguably should deserve a bit less credit for. So that's attribution. But the weakness of attribution is for certain brands that perhaps have many people in the audience who already would convert. So the challenge is, if you're imagine McDonald's advertising on Rogan. So they have 10% of the audience right now each week going to McDonald's to get a double quarter pounder, or each month. So even if McDonald's didn't run an ad on, even if they ran like a blank spot, just some PSA, the regular pixel-based attribution would still show 10% of Rogan show converted because they were exposed and then went and purchased. So in this case, I sort of picked like a very extreme example, but that is sort of to illustrate how the regular attribution might not be quite what there are cases where you need to figure out, well, how many people would already go to McDonald's regardless of whether they heard the ad on Rogan or not. So that's where incrementality comes in, and where you compare the purchase or the conversion lift comes in, where you compare how many people who were exposed then proceed to purchase and visit the website and do whatever the action is, compared to the control group, the baseline, during a similar period by people who weren't exposed, to then net out that difference. So those are the two differences, and there are incrementality is obviously, like, it's a little bit tougher for some reasons in some cases to do the attribution. Attribution is a bit simpler, but that's sort of the situation where you could imagine needing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can't have one without the other. So you can't run incrementality tests without pixel-based attribution. But I think going through all of the slides that we previously talked about, there's a lot of reasons why you would want to test it, whether you're small or large. And I think that's really a conversation with your team and your agency or whatnot to, figure out what you can optimize and what those next steps are. So we've done a lot of talking. Let's go into the actual technical, how does incrementality work? So real quickly, before we dive into really the important components, again, as Grant has sort of stated, and some of these misconceptions, a lot of what incrementality has been before some of this, the evolutions of not only Podscribe, but other providers as well, it's been thought of as a one-off thing. It's something you do when you have a really big budget and you test it once or twice a year. Podscribe's methodology in particular is trying to sort of, again, break down that notion. And while it's not going to be a perfect, constantly ongoing thing, really the heart of incrementality and the benefits that you can get from it are continuously running it, whether it's on a quarterly basis, or monthly, just so you can better understand, again, as I'm scaling up, as we're increasing new shows, what are those new audiences incrementally that we're reaching, and are those new shows, those new campaigns, and new channels, if you're new to podcasting, really driving incremental growth. So really the high level steps, Podscribe, we identify the exposed listeners. We then create a control group out of those. We measure the baselines, we measure the results, we run the tests, and we have the ability to sort of continue that cycle and go on again and again. And Grant, you have been in the space for so long. You have probably, more than a lot of people, really watched the evolution of what incrementality, pixel-based attribution, and just measurement capabilities exist in the podcast advertising space. And can you give us, just a high-level understanding of what incrementality used to look like when it came to, again, one of the most important things, which is creating that control group, and how you sort of see it evolve and how it could be better?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we'll go through like some specific examples, but qualitatively for me, I've been watching incrementality for a long time. Another similar kind of test structure that we think about a lot is like creative A/B testing, which I feel like has a very similar kind of structure to it in terms of you need a good test and control group. And so for me, because of kind of that confluence of those two testing structures, I've been really focused on like control group methodology, right? And so one of my biggest frustrations over the last couple of years has been, and to my knowledge, what I had been exposed to, or what I had been shown, not exposed to, a little confusing language there, was control groups that were dictated by, maybe DMA or zip code, which is fine. but also by time of listen, versus, necessarily like what they were listening to. So the example I always use when kind of talking to brands at Right Side Up is, you could have somebody commuting home from work in Denver at 5:30 p.m., very common drive time, listening to, Joe Rogan, enjoying it, great. And, that person could be a male 35, making $100,000 a year. You could also have a woman staying late at the office, still in Denver at 5:30, maybe 40, making $250,000 a year and listening to Call Her Daddy, right? Or something like this. And, that to me is like not necessarily a control and expose group that's valid, because the listener profiles are like very different. And so that's kind of like the issue I always had was, podcasts is so rich in diversity of the content that we can access. We needed to get better as an industry at identifying control and expose group, yes, against DMA, yes, against time to listen, but also against, what they're listening to, which I think is a segue to where we are now.
Yeah, perfect. And again, you and Pete have worked on this methodology and bringing in those, frustrations and how it can be improved. So Pete, can you, with that knowledge and with understanding what incrementality, similar control groups used to look like, how has Podscribe advanced our methodology, and what are things that we take into consideration when creating what, again, the incrementality test is only as good as your control group. So how do we create those control groups?
Right. So yeah, getting to the meat of things. But yeah, before I do, one quick thing that I wanted to mention is with attribution, just going back, just one thought before I forget it, that many other platforms, I think I was sort of saying like, Facebook or other platforms often will report the regular attribution results. So if you're looking at, our say results for podcasting, sometimes it can make sense if you're trying to compare closer to apples, like looking at the regular attribution results can make sense if you're trying to compare it to say like, another platform, another channel's tool that is using those as well. So just wanted to mention, before, if everybody thinks, oh, we should immediately jump to incrementality, you might end up cutting podcasts short if other channels are not also measuring the incremental lift. So like sort of one quick thing to keep in mind with that. So then, okay, on to how we create the control groups. So starting by, we find all, say, the listeners who were exposed to the ad. Then for each one, we'll find somebody in the same zip code who has the most similar listening history. So they're geographically similar. So the control group should roughly have the same geographic makeup of the test group. And then we see which podcasts the household, which podcasts and streaming channels the household was exposed to. And of course, often you don't find like a perfect match, but maybe 3 of the 4 shows overlap. So as much as we can, because I think probably for most people here listen to podcasts, you could imagine, if I knew what podcasts you listen to, I could probably, and where you lived, I could kind of know, not everything, but, a decent amount about you and what your interests are and who you are. So it does sort of a lot, I think, if you know what podcast somebody listens to. Of course, not for every household do we have like 6 podcasts to really dive into it, but that's the aim.
Yeah. And Pete, to build on that, like the way performance marketers think about podcast advertising, one of the ways is looking at what podcasts perform well and then trying to kind of guess like where are the lookalike audiences there, and using quantitative research and past performance history to do that. So I think that really lines up with kind of what we were already doing as an industry for 10 years of, if you're on show X in this category, maybe we go and try 3 other shows in that category to try to talk to the same person and build some, what I call inter-channel frequency, right?
Amazing. Love it. Okay. So, outside again of the similar, which, in mind is really the closest, and best way to test our incrementality, there's other ideals. And then, Podscribe does have some alternatives, for different control groups that you can create. Pete, do you just want to go through these at a high level? And then I think we'll get to the meat of it, which is really diving into the results.
Yeah, so there's probably somebody on this call thinking, why do we even need to like make these similar control groups? Why can't the publisher just create a holdout set? And I would agree, that's the ideal way to do it for sure. If the publisher can randomly hold out 10% of the audience, perfect, and it's during the same time period, yeah, that is definitely the best way. to do it, because then you never have the question of, are the control and test groups actually similar? You can avoid that question. But the problem is that often I don't the machinery on the publisher, on the ad server side, is not quite always there and always making it so convenient to have a perfect holdout set. And often, if it is there, they'll, the publisher may rightly want to charge if they're putting in some PSA spot for it. So it might not be at no cost to do such a thing. So I would want to add the caveat that I would agree, if anybody's thinking the ideal is to have a perfect randomly sampled holdout set of the audience, I think that is that is an ideal. But that being said, in lieu of that, which is not always available, what is always available is creating a similar audience from the exposed audience and looking at their performance during the same time frame. So that's sort of why I think usually that one is the most versatile. It doesn't require any additional setup or anything on the publisher or advertiser side. We just will do it. And just two quick alternatives worth mentioning that are maybe pseudo incrementality to a degree. One way that we were kind of working on earlier, but have sort of fallen back a little bit on, is looking at how the audience who was exposed, how much they were purchasing before the campaign started, which you would think is a fairly reasonable way to do it. But the problem is what if Black Friday was before the campaign started? Then this group of people who are exposed, they may have purchased a ton before the campaign started, and your baseline is super high. Then when the campaign starts, it's like early December or something, and they're purchasing way lower, and you think, wow, this campaign is doing nothing compared to the baseline. So prior, it can be all right, but you might risk, and we see it too, like the fluctuations per week, even out of Black Friday, can be sizable in a lot of cases. So you're really, with that method, you're really exposing yourself to sort of the luck of the draw and what happened. And yeah, same show. The problem is, if you're buying episodic ads on a show and you want us to find listeners of the show who are not exposed to the ad but listen to some other episode, then we have to find people who are not subscribers of the show, because subscribers get every episode. Not people who are not subscribers just get random episodes, and subscribers and people who are not subscribers are different in ways. So that one also, it can be done, but I don't know if so. But those are the reasons why I think the ideals are up top in the highlighted section.
That's great. And I think, again, the thing to note here is that, we do offer these, and there's lots of different situations where you'd want to use one or the other. There's different use cases. So I think, as Pete sort of mentioned, as ad tech serving technology continues to evolve, these things are only going to be more improved. But, Podscribe wanted to create a way to not only offer multiple options, but find ways to sort of work around that and still be able to measure these results. So once again, a lot of talking. I think everybody is probably excited to jump into the results, and specifically have Grant, who is our resident picker-aparter, sort of dive in and not only guess which ones might be the most valid, but also the thought process and validating of these control groups. So Pete, I'll pass it over to you. You want to share your screen, and we'll walk through the results again. There is a link inside of the chat of these results if you want to follow along, or just view as we share our screens. So
okay, so I'll share my screen in a sec, and as context, we'll play a game here now. And as part of this game, Grant will look at 3 example incrementality results, and he's going to pick which one he believes the most, which is the worst, and which is in the middle. So you guys could see, some basically real results. They're modified very slightly, but they are more or less real. So Grant will then go through and pick which ones he likes the most or the least. And feel free, if you're so inclined, to also guess in the chat. So let me share my screen here, hopefully the right tab. And okay, so people's eyes might be starting to glaze over now, seriously. But let me just try to explain it in a very high level way. And the podcast industry is big on Google Sheets, so we wanted to start it also with a Google Sheet, but we are working to add this onto Dash, where you will have a nice little switch that says turn incrementality on, and all the results will just change. we're not quite there yet, but you can still see the results in spreadsheet form for the time being. So, okay, so what are we looking at? Let me start with this channel tab. So there's two different tabs here. This thing's kind of in the way. Yeah, I can move it. Oh, there we go. So there's two different tabs here. We got the channel tab and the campaign tab. So we could run incrementality on all your impressions in podcasting as a whole. So you can then report up, to the CMO or whoever's buying, be like, okay, here's our total impact on podcasting across all campaigns without needing to funnel it through an MPA or an MMM or do a bazillion things. So of course, if we're not tracking all the buys, that you might have to extrapolate out a bit more, but in theory, we can then provide the results on the channel level, so podcasting as a whole or streaming as a whole. And then, so that's tab one, just for, advertiser one, and I'll get into the columns in a sec. And then tab two is, instead of just a channel at a whole, what if you want to know, like, you're buying on SmartList or some big shows, or or even smaller shows, what's the incrementality behind certain specific campaigns? So both are available, and we put just some examples for both in there. So okay, starting with the channel results, if we're taking a look here, so we've got three advertisers: advertiser 1, 2, and 3. And Grant will guess which one he thinks which results he believes the most, the least, and somewhere in between. And what we see here is, okay, for each month, November, December, January, we've got an action. So, in November, we got purchases, November views here, December views. And then for each month, we show how many events the control group had, the control group who's not exposed, how many purchases they had in November, how many purchases they had in December. And then we also have the exposed group. So this group did receive an impression, at least one impression anywhere in this time period. So then we can see, okay, well, what's the difference between the control and the exposed, say in November, December, January, and the lift here is just basically the difference between exposed and control. And then you could see too, for each month, November, how many impressions did we measure for advertiser 1? So in November, 17 million impressions for advertiser 1. This is also November, so 17 million again. And then here is the incremental count of how many purchases we accounted for in November and December, and then how many incremental views we account for in November and December. So, and what you'll notice is, and Grant, I could turn over to him in a second, is there in November, the lift, so the test group that was exposed to the ad here, they're purchasing at basically, they have 23,000 purchases. The control group has 19,000. They're the same size. So the exposed group, which kind of makes sense, they're purchasing more because they've been exposed to impressions. They have a 21% lift. And then in March, we have like 3 months of basically no impressions. The lift sinks back down to 10%. So maybe that's, kind of like the baseline difference between the two groups, but you can see when the impressions the most were the highest, there was the highest lift. So maybe roughly the lift is, if you're doing diff of the diff, it's about 10% of a difference. And so that's sort of how we're getting this number. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Grant. So if you want to dissect these results here, which do you like the most or the least?
Yeah, definitely. So I think kind of looking at them advertiser by advertiser, if you can scroll up to advertiser 1. So, you kind of hit it. You can see the clear incremental lift here. Personally, I really always look for kind of the baseline of lift percentage. We talked a lot about the control group methodology and how good it is on Podscribe. That doesn't make it perfect, and you're always going to have some sort of like baseline difference between the two groups of audiences. So for me, my eyes obviously always look for, lift on a deep funnel event. So you've got that 21%, 17%, and then kind of that lingering 12% with 10 1,000 impressions or so. So that to me, I kind of do the mental math of, all right, 18% or so lift against what looks like the baseline of, February and March is what I would check out, call it 10%. So at that rate, you're looking at 8 or 10% lift. Really good. So that's when I finally kind of have an opinion in my head of like the results, right? I'm like, okay, 8 to 10% lift, this looks good. And then I check out the correlation, p-value, and r-squared values. So the kind of way to think about these relationships, and Pete, correct me if I'm wrong here, I was an English major, is, correlation, the higher the better, right? And that basically describes as one number goes up, what does the other number do? In this case, as impressions go up, what does the overall converting activity do for the exposed group? P-values you want to be as low as possible, so the close to 0, the better, to kind of signify statistical significance. And then r-squared similarly does the same thing, but you want it to be closer to 1. So when I'm checking my view on this particular campaign, I'm thinking, wow, 0.95% correlation value, super good. Really low p-value, awesome. R-squared 0.89, amazing. Heads up, it's very rarely this clear, but this one looks really good. So let's move on to the next one here in number 2. Number 2 is really interesting, right? Because you have no baseline, and that's the first thing that stands out to me. This is 4 consecutive months of activity. The activity is at kind of a similar scale, but it does start to grow kind of towards the middle. You can see in row 22 for February that, that's the highest impression load by quite a bit, over 101. Thanks, Cam. 101 million impressions. So that's the highest month. You see the lift percentage is also at 75%. So like, wow, this looks amazing, right? So again, I'm forming an assumption in my head. I'm thinking, all right, like that looks pretty good. Then I'm looking at the correlation percentage. Oh, 0.41. Not the best. P-value is looking a little high, 0.5. R-squared really low, 0.17. Personally, I look at R-squared. I need a 0.2 or above before I start kind of tossing data. Here's where I think this is challenging for advertiser number 2. There's no baseline. Clearly, there's a lot of incremental activity going on, but we have no idea if that would happen anyways, because there is no diff of the diff, as Pete said. There is no baseline of activity. So what I would recommend for this advertiser is, wow, this looks really good. Like, you should have a lot of faith in podcast advertising. What we should do is probably go dark for 2 months, as much as that pains me to say, if we can tolerate it, and see kind of like what those control and exposed groups do shake out as. At Right Side Up, we've done some decay curve studies on kind of like the latency of conversion activity. It's usually about 3 to 4 weeks. So we know if you're dark for 2 months, you'll get a true kind of dark period and be able to kind of reset that baseline. So that's what I would do for this advertiser. So for this one, I'm like, half and half. Let's go to number 3. All right, perfect. So we're looking at installs and leads. This one's a little tricky because I don't know what's deeper, an install or a lead. I assume an install, so we'll go under that assumption. Here you've got kind of like a really ideal baseline case. You've got those like 2 weeks of dark data. Presuming that nothing was happening during that period, that would be really clean. Then you've got kind of this incremental activity peaking at about 10 million impressions in February 5th, the week of February 5th, and you've got 27% lift. So I'm like, all right, 23, 18, call it 20% baseline lift, 27% lift. All right, so net 7% above my baseline. That feels really, really good. And again, my correlation, my p-value, and my r-squared looks super solid. I think if this one is to be improved, I'd love to get like a couple more weeks of data before January, just to kind of see if that baseline actually holds true, because candidly, like that looks a little high to me. So I think in ranking, I would probably do advertiser 1 is the best. That's a really strong, clear case performance and incrementality. Number 3 is probably second best, just needs a little bit more of a baseline. And then number 2, unfortunately, while the numbers look great, you need a baseline there to understand how real that is or not. And reminding everyone that we just ran through a lot of stuff. Please drop questions in the Q&A in the chat for Q&A later, because we can get to it.
I'm glad I saved these 3 columns for you to explain.
Thank you, Pete. Yeah, I think that was on your note card, but I got you.
But to summarize what Grant's saying, I know there's probably most people in here are like, I don't want to have to look at all this and do all this, work. I think that sooner or later, it'll be on the dash. Really, the only column that is most relevant is K, to see, okay, what's the incremental value? And then if you're going to pick one of these to say, like, how significant are the results, they're all useful, but I would probably go with p-value. And if p-value is below, probably like 0.2, okay, it's pretty solid. If it's, above that, maybe there's some things that could be done to fix the data or to look at in a different way. And so, yeah, it can be done on the month level, as you can see, January, February, March, or the week level for any set of events. And I think key thing too, as Grant was harping on a lot, that makes it a lot easier for the attribution to work better is if there's a period either after, the campaigns have run or before, where we can kind of see what does it settle down to overall without impressions. That's really helpful. The worst case for incrementality that makes it the hardest for us is if we just see basically like the same amount of impressions just endlessly and there's no break or anything. So that's what kind of is the toughest. But even if you don't want to, of course, turn off podcasting, for a period, it could still be done perhaps like publisher by publisher or show by show. There's like other ways. So even if the signal overall, is kind of flat per month, I think there's other ways to look at it. So with that, let me jump here to the campaign. So it's virtually the same columns, more or less. The only thing is now we're looking at campaigns specifically. So this one was just as a whole. If you're as a company to decide what is podcasting doing for me? Okay, in March, here was the total. Now we go into a certain campaign. What was the incremental value? And one of the things to notice too is this control group here, these numbers of purchases, this group was not exposed to any ad, but that's just how much they're purchasing regardless of not even being exposed to any ad. So that to a degree can give you a bit of the level of perhaps the inflation for some advertisers in pixel-based attribution. So I'll turn it over to Grant to hear what he thinks here with these 3 campaigns.
Yeah, absolutely. So advertiser one, or campaign number 1, right? This RON campaign. By the way, I think incrementality is great for RON. If you're looking for efficient ways to place buys across multiple shows, RON is run of network is the way to do that. And it's often hard to optimize or really to gauge success. So this is a key tool in opening up that vision of like, how do we monetize some of those smaller shows out there? Here you can see like, this is crystal clear, really low baseline lift. And then you got that 32 and 20% that directly correlates with the activity from the impressions. Good stats as well, in terms of correlation, p-value, and R-squared. So this one is looking really, really good to me. And I'm going to move pretty quickly because I know we're kind of short on time here. Campaign number 2, looking at, installs again, presuming that that's the deep funnel KPI. Again, really good baseline. So that's always to see. It's monthly. That's always nice. And then clear lift again over that baseline, 26, 26, 24 over a baseline of call it 10. And then really good stats on this, except for, well, yeah, actually the R-squared looks good too. So that's really exciting. And, we do see a lot of negatives on this, which I think is really interesting. I do notice that those are presumably in like top funnel events. So that could be a little bit of noise. Could be worth looking at other campaigns or even a channel-wide analysis to know how widespread that is. But if install is a deep funnel event, this is looking pretty positive to me. And then number 3, great. So this one's super interesting, right? This basically says that your advertising is hurting you, right? If you just took the control and expose lift percentage, this says stop spending money because you're losing customers, which, intuitively makes no sense. And this is why, some of those stats values are really important. You can see the p-value is off the charts, 0.3. It's too high. So that for me is, too much. Correlation, by the way, a -1 correlation is still actually like a really good correlation. 0 is random. 1 or -1 is completely ordered and causal. So that's the way to kind of read that -0.45. And the R squared is really, really low too. So too high of a p-value, too low of an R squared. And honestly, as much as performance marketers like myself, we love the stats, we love the spreadsheets. Sometimes you just gotta think with your brain and just be like, why would spending money on podcast advertising lose me customers? And I think that there's something to do with that here. So for my grand total, I think we're going to go in order. I think number 1 is probably the best, the cleanest data set. Number 2 is the second. And then number 3, unfortunately, is just not valid.
I would agree. And I would say too, just the last thing on this is, for the third one, I would agree it's not really valid. Why does it make sense that there's a negative relationship? The more impressions you have, the more lift. And one clue here as to what's happening is look how low these lead events are. There's like a couple dozen per month. That's just a very low number versus if we're looking at these like thousands, hundreds. So what really does, I've noticed, help the results is if we're looking at events that just have a lot more volume. So if it's like 23 events in a month, that often just lends itself to be just more noisy of an output. So with that, thank you everybody who was bearing with us there.
Yeah,
so people left. So maybe turn it over to questions or in the last few minutes.
Hello, can I see my screen? I think so. Great. So quickly, in terms of what's next, what the future of Podscribe and incrementality in general hold, I don't know, Pete or Grant, if you want to chime in here, but really, again, it goes back to that continuous incrementality model, the availability to have it in your dashboard so that you don't have to do all of that thinking, and you can always dive into the results, look at those p-values if you're interested, and then vast tags. Anything, Pete or Grant, you guys wanted to chime in here?
I think that's the main thing. I think you'll always be able to dive in and view the results to see those specific numbers. But the two main things are making it just a toggle on the dash and doing all we can to make more of the results statistically significant, because we wouldn't want to give the impression that every campaign is going to be perfectly statistically significant. It's not. I think generally we can there are ways to make it for most people there are for the channel or their biggest campaigns, but just not every campaign is going to look perfect and give up the perfect signal.
Awesome. All right. So, again, to round this off before we go into questions, I think the thing to note here is obviously incrementality is incredible, and it's really important, especially, if you're a small brand trying to figure out where is the next channel I should expand to, which one is going to drive the most incremental new customers, incremental audiences, but also for larger brands, as both Pete and Grant point out, can be really, really helpful to just better understand your attribution results from a pixel-based standpoint. So without it, it isn't possible. I think the whole industry is going through a big revolution in terms of, obviously still using promo code surveys, that first party, zero party data, but, giving more credit where credit is deserved, and, ad exposures to purchase, looking at the multi-touch capacity, understanding top of funnel metrics, pixel-based attribution really allows that. So let's dive into Q&A. We had a couple questions. First, I think, Grant and Pete, but maybe more Grant. Is there a spend threshold to, you need to be in minimum spend to really consider incrementality and, the benefits of it? And again, seeing if the results are going to be statistically significant.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think if you're kind of on the bottom end of what we consider kind of like valid, meaningful podcast spend, you're probably better off taking an attribution and as a bonus incrementality approach. So that is to say, you should be tracking to see if your podcasts are working or not, preferably with a partner like Podscribe. And then if you are already doing the attribution, then you can talk to the folks at Podscribe and say, hey, I already have the data. Can you run an incrementality study for me? And then that will be kind of like your determination of whether this is the right thing to do for you or not. I think to put a number in it depends on way too many factors, like how much are you spending in the channel generally, how many shows are you spending against, and then also how much activity do you have going on across your entire brand site or app or whatever, right? So tough to say. I would probably just ballpark it at like, I don't know, maybe 50 grand a month would probably be like scraping by on statistical significance. But again, you could configure a program that spends 20K a month and you can get there. You could also configure a program that spends 110K a month and doesn't get there at all. So lots of variables to consider.
Great. And we'll put Grant's contact information at the end. So if you actually want to ask him, have him audit, what you're currently doing to see if it's worth it, that'd be a great place to go. Pete, anything else you wanted to add there?
Yeah, one quick point on that is actually funny enough. I think we could get more significant incrementality results from somebody spending 25K a month who puts our tag on their site for like 2 months, or 2 months or more is ideal, but of course that's tough. But if they have our tag on their website for 2 months before a campaign starts, so we can get a really good baseline, and then they buy, that could give us a really clear signal, even more so perhaps than somebody who's spending $1 million a month and spending exactly the same each month on, not changing any shows or anything, and we didn't get any results or anything beforehand. So more spend is maybe more likely to have an impact, but there are still ways that you could configure it, usually with like some periods of darkness, that could give us a much clearer signal, even with very low spend.
Okay, great. So not necessarily about spend, but how much data we actually have access to, how many conversions you're tracking and you're getting on a regular basis. Awesome. So Pete, you had mentioned, that Podscribe can not only do multi-touch attribution, but you can in fact go in the platform and actually, narrow down those attribution settings. So you can window down your conversion window, what time period we're going to, from ad exposure to purchase, attribute those conversions to podcast ads. How does this flexibility, specifically on the conversion window side, affect incrementality? Where does it come into play, and can it be used to optimize for those results?
Yeah, sometimes what we'll see done is, somebody will have their regular incrementality results or their regular attribution results, then they'll run incrementality, and maybe they'll think, okay, the attribution results are like looking a little bit higher than what incrementality is showing. So then what they could do is whittle down. They could exclude less confident conversions, say ones that had a refer URL of Facebook or have a UTM source of like SMS in the landing URL, and exclude those, or exclude prior customers, or tighten the conversion window from like 30 to 21 days to then make the attribution results more or less match the incrementality results. And then, because you're basically just taking out those less confident conversions that might have happened otherwise. So the settings, while they can be sort of confusing, they can let you tweak the regular attribution results to almost mirror the incrementality outputs in a lot of cases after you've kind of done the double check. And of course, the ideal is maybe just like a toggle that's like incrementality on the dash. But for some reasons, as you can see, like not every campaign can we totally get great statistically significant results. So it's sort of another way to get at that.
Great. And really, again, putting the control in, whether it's the buyer or the seller, so that they can view the results in any way they want. Okay, awesome. So Grant, from the buyer side, again, let's imagine that we were looking at advertiser one in that the channel analysis, and they won. There was some really great statistical significance. How would you advise, based on those results, to that advertiser what they could do from an optimization perspective, and maybe give an example of a strategy that you've sort of led following the results or positive results of an incrementality test?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think if you're getting results like that, especially on a channel-wide readout, I think the answer is like, not to be that guy, but like you be investing more in the channel, right? If you're getting truly incremental results, and I think like what we like to do with our clients is think about cost pers in terms of kind of like a gross cost per, and then like a net cost per. If those net cost pers are looking good within kind of what you see for other channels, then I think the clear and obvious answer is invest more in podcast advertising, which I'm sure all the publishers on this call are like, yeah, Grant, good. But I think more to the point, if you're achieving that kind of statistical significance, you can do kind of that analysis that we talked about earlier in this webinar of, digging into maybe show level or campaign level incrementality, and then making optimizations based on that. You might be able to just kind of like sharpen your knife a little bit on the campaign which will allow you to inevitably probably optimize out of certain shows and maybe open up new testing opportunities that can improve your reach, increase your inter-channel frequency, ultimately lead to better brand outcomes. So I think all signs are good in that instance. There's a method to spend more based on them. There's a method to optimize based on those results. But it's a really good exercise, and I think we're getting so close to true attribution on podcast advertising, and that's something that gets me really jazzed up because we want to make a difference with our brands at Right Set Up. So this is really exciting stuff for us.
Awesome. And even reallocating, so you see that there's such a huge incremental lift in podcasting, maybe take some of that budget from Facebook and see if you can, continue results. Awesome. I know we're running up on time, so I have one last question, I think for both of you really. Regarding pixel-based attribution in podcasting, incrementality testing, from your experience, what are the main barriers, whether it's from an advertiser or a publisher standpoint, to really accepting this technology and offering it to not only their advertisers but their teams?
I think the main barrier has been it just not being available entirely. Like we've had it for a number of months now, but we've made more of a concerted effort recently to make it available. The big focus is putting it on the dashboard, but I think there's a number of things that have to be working right to make it available. So I think there's that, and I think also the education of what is the difference between attribution and incrementality, which I think we could do a better job on, because the space has evolved a lot in measuring from promos, which still are is not in a bad way at all. But the pixel-based attribution, and now it's from there, okay, we have pixel-based attribution, but can we whittle it down a little bit? And funny enough, I don't think I think a lot of other channels also have this problem. So I think there's really an opportunity for podcasting to have the most convincing attribution of all channels, and that attribution to actually go into other channels too. Because I do think this kind of pixel, possible inflation for some brands thing happens elsewhere too. I don't think it invalidates the attribution results, but I think it's something to be aware of for when you need to use one or the other.
Yeah, and to that point, Pete, I kind of agree with you in my answer too. Like, I think one of the biggest barriers to this is over reliance in paid social and paid search and like overall growth marketing campaigns. Like, I think if I was truly in house, I would be a little bit scared to be moving dollars from let's say branded search to podcast advertising, because one feels like such bedrock, right, of my attribution and my growth campaign, and one feels like a risk, and that's of course accordingly search and podcasts. So I think part of it is just kind of the legacy of the portfolio of growth marketing, right? And we could say that now the growth marketing has been a thing for 20 years, which is crazy, right? But now we have these entrenched ideas of how you should build a growth campaign for like efficient performance marketing. And I think, with new technologies like you guys are working on at Podscribe, with the deprecation of cookies, which is going to be huge, right? I think we're going to be shaking some of those foundations loose. To answer your question, my actual answer was going to be, I think understanding, it might not be a barrier today, but it will be in the next couple of months as we continue to try to perfect this, is understanding the impact that YouTube-based impressions have on all of this modeling, right? And I don't think that's like an unattainable answer. Of course, like if you're listening YouTube, please give Pete all the IP addresses and device IDs, right? But like, I think that there's a way that we can be really intentional and, we can be better than guessing, but slightly less certain than certain on how much YouTube impressions are playing into the overall converting audience, as well as the overall incremental converting audience. And I think that's going to be a big project that, we'll be working on a lot together over the coming months and probably years. But we can't not talk about YouTube and podcasting because it's the biggest platform for podcast consumption today. So.
Amazing. All right. Well, if anybody has any more questions, drop them down. We have a bunch more that we can sort of send over with their answers, but we've had you guys long enough. So if you are currently a customer or using Podscribe and you want to look into testing incrementality, reach out to your customer service rep, your technical, and they'd be happy to help you set that up. If you're not using Podscribe and you just want to get a demo or learn more about what your capabilities are, again, from a buyer or a seller perspective, click on this link. I'll drop it in the chat. And then, we'd be happy to offer around 20% off for your first couple months. And then as we promised, thank you again, Grant. I think this was really, really awesome, specifically, representing the buyer side. If you want to get in touch with Grant, have him look at your incrementality results, have him, sort of discuss, should I be running this? Should I be testing this? We've got his email here. If you're interested in whether you're thinking about starting podcast advertising, scaling up, or trying to just validate the efficiency of the channel as a whole, Right Side Up is an incredible company doing really big things across the growth marketing space, but their expertise in podcast advertising is amazing. Grant, I don't know if you want to add any final thought there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, happy to help, take a look at anything. And then, like you said, Amelia, shameless plug, Right Set Up. We can help with growth marketing needs across any paid marketing. Yeah. So would be happy to talk. Never a pitch, but always a conversation and usually successful brand outcomes. So would be eager to hear from you.
Amazing. And as we promised, we're going to be doing a whole series of what we're calling sort of like modern measurement in podcast advertising. So we've got a bunch of webinars coming up that are, not only going to further dive into incrementality, but really demystify pixel-based attribution. How do you interpret results? Looking at multiple, attribution models, windows, exclusions. How you can hear it alongside first and third party data, top of funnel metrics, all of that great stuff. So once again, I will drop all of these links. If you want to stay in the loop and get notified when we'll be putting these webinars on, please sign up and we'd be happy to, again, update you on those. But yeah, thank you all. This was really great. I guess the last thing, the little thumbs thing, if you are, heard of Make Better, this is Podscribe and a collective sort of industry podcast where we're, talking about all of these things. We just released a recent episode really breaking down pixel-based attribution. So once again, thank you guys so much. I'm going to drop these links in here. So stick around if you would like to chat with Grant or, stay in the loop with podcast stuff. Anything, Grant or Pete, you guys want to add before we send everybody on their way?
Just gratitude. Thank you for joining. Yeah.
And see you next week for whoever will be in LA.
Indeed. Exciting times.
Awesome. Amazing.
All right. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.